Book 1, Chapter 4 of The Black Star Passes by John Campbell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kurt Ziegler. Again, Morey and Arcot were looking at the great Jersey aerodrome, out on the fields that had been broad marshes centuries before. Now they had been filled in and stretched for miles, a great landing field, close to the great city across the river. The men in the car above were watching the field, hanging inert, a point of glistening metal, high in the deep velvet of the purple sky. For 15 miles of air separated them from the transcontinental machine below. Now they saw through their field glasses the great plane was lumbering slowly across the field, gaining momentum as it headed westward into the breeze. Then it seemed to be barely clearing the great skyscrapers that towered 2,400 feet into the air, arching over 4 or 5 city blocks. From this height they were toys made of colored paper, soft colors, glistening in the hot noon sunlight, and around and about them wove lines of flashing, moving helicopters, the individual lost in the mass of the million or so swiftly moving machines. Only the higher, steadily moving levels of traffic were visible to them. "Just look at that traffic! Thousands and thousands coming back into the city after going home to lunch. And every day the number of helicopters is increasing. If it hadn't been for your invention of this machine, conditions would soon be impossible. The air blast in the cities is unbearable now, and getting worse all the time. Many machines can't get enough power to hold themselves up at the middle levels. There is a down current over 100 miles an hour at the 400-foot level in downtown New York. It makes a racer to climb fast there. If it were not for gyroscopic stabilizers, they could never live in that huge air pocket. I have to drive in through there. I'm always afraid that somebody with an old worn-out bus will have stabilizer failure and will really smash things." Morey was a skillful pilot, and realized, as few others did, the dangers of that downward air blast that the countless whirring blades maintained in a constant roar of air. The office buildings now had double walls, with thick layers of sound-absorbing materials to stop the roar of the cyclonic blast that continued almost unabated 12 hours a day. "Oh, I don't know about that, Morey," replied Arcot. "This thing has some drawbacks. Remember that if we had about 10 million of these machines hung in the air of New York City, there would be a noticeable drop in the temperature. We'd probably have an Arctic climate year in and year out. You know, though, how unbearably hot it gets in the city by noon, even on the coldest winter days, due to the heating effect of the air friction of all those thousands of blades. I have known the temperature of the air to go up to 50 degrees. There probably will have to be a sort of balance between the two types of machines. It will be a terrific economic problem, but at the same time it will solve the difficulties of the great companies who have been fermenting grain residues for alcohol. The castor bean growers are also going to bring down their prices a lot when this machine kills the market. They will also be more anxious to extract the carbon from cornstalks for reducing ores of iron and other metals." As the ship flew high above the transcontinental plane, the men discussed the economic values of the different applications of Arcot's discoveries, from the huge power stations they could make to the cooling and ventilating of houses. "Dick, you mentioned the cooling effect on New York City. With the millions on millions of these machines that there will be, with huge power plants, with 1,000 other different applications in use, won't the terrific drain energy from the air cause the whole world to become a little cooler?" asked Fuller. "I doubt it, Bob," said Arcot slowly. "I've thought of that myself. Remember that most of the energy we use eventually ends up as heat anyway. And just remember the decillions of ergs of energy that the sun is giving off. True, we only get an infinitesimal portion of that energy, but what we do get is more than enough for us. Powerhouses can be established very conveniently in the tropics, where they will cool the air, and the energy can be used to refine metals. That means that the surplus heat of the tropics will find a use. Weather control will also be possible by the direction control of great winds. We could set huge director tubes on tops of the mountains, and blow the winds in whatever direction best suited us. Not the blown wind itself, but the vast volume of air it carried with it, would be able to cool the temperature zones in the summer from the cold of the poles, and warm it in the winter with the heat of the tropics. After a thoughtful silence, Arcot continued. "And there's another thing it may make possible in the future. A thing that may be hard to accept as a commercial proposition. We have a practically inexhaustible source of energy now, but we have no sources of minerals that will last indefinitely. Copper is becoming more and more rare. Had it not been for the discoveries of the great copper fields of the Sahara in Alaska, we wouldn't have any now. Platinum is exhausted, and even iron is becoming more and more valuable. We are facing a shortage of metals. Do you realize that within the next 2 centuries we will be unable to maintain this civilization unless we get new sources of certain basic raw materials? But we have one other chance now. The solution is there are 9 planets in this solar system. Neptune and Uranus are each far vaster than Earth. They are utterly impossible for life as we know it, but a small colony might be established there to refine metals for the distant Earth. We might be able to build domed and sealed cities, but first we could try the nearer planets, Mars, Venus, or some satellite such as our moon. I certainly hope that this machine will make it possible." For some time they sat in silence as they sped along, high above the green plains of Indiana. Chicago lay like some tremendous jewel far off on the horizon to the right and ahead. 5 miles below them was a huge bulk of the transcontinental plane, seemed a toy as it swung slowly across the fields, actually traveling over 600 miles an hour. At last Morey spoke. "You're right, Arcot. We have to think of the interplanetary aspects of this someday. Oh, there's Chicago. We'd better start the vacuum gas protector. And the radar. We may soon see some action." The 3 men immediately forgot the somewhat distant danger of the metal shortage. There were a number of adjustments to be made, and these were quickly completed while the machine forged evenly, steadily ahead. The generator was adjusted to maximum efficiency, and the various tubes were tested separately, for though they were all new, and each good for 25,000 hours, it would be inconvenient, to say the least, if one failed while they were in action. Each tested perfect, and they knew from the smooth functioning of the various relays that governed the generator as the loads on it varied, that it must be working perfectly, at least something less than 1/2 maximum rating. Steadily they flew on, waiting tensely for the first sign of a glow from the tiny neon tube indicator on the panel before Morey. "This looks familiar, Dick," said Morey, looking about at the fields of the low line of the blue mountains far off on the western horizon. "I think it was about here that we took our little nap in the flying wheelchair, as the papers called it. It would be about here. Look! It is about here. Get ready for action, Fuller. You're taking the machine gun. I'll work the invisibility disruptor, and Arcot will run the ship. Let's go!" On the board before him, the tiny neon tube flickered dully, glowed briefly like a piece of red-hot iron, then went out. In a moment it was glowing again, and then quickly its brilliance mounted till it was a line of crimson. Morey snapped the switch from the general radar to the beam receiver, that he might locate the machine exactly. It was fully a minute before the neon tube flashed into life once more. The pirate was flying just ahead of the big plane, very likely gassing them. All around him were the air guardsmen, unaware that the enemy was so near. As the disruptor beam could be projected only about a mile, they would have to dive down on the enemy at once. An instant later the great plane beneath them seemed to be rushing upward at a terrific speed. 2 radar beams were kept focused constantly on the pirate's craft. When they were about 2 miles from the 2 planes, the neon tube blazed brilliantly with a clash of opposing energy. The pirate was trying to maintain his invisibility, while the rapidly growing strength of the machine above strove to batter it down. In moments the ammeter connected with the disruptor beam began to rise so rapidly that Morey watched it with some concern. Despite the 10 kilowatt set being used to project the beam, the resistance of the apparatus on board the pirate ship was amazing. Abruptly the 3 became aware of a rapidly solidifying cloud before them. The interference of the beam Morey was sending had begun breaking down the molecular oscillation that permitted the light to pass freely through the pirate's craft. Suddenly there was a circle of blue light about the shadow form, and in a moment later the ionized air relapsed into normal condition as the pirate's apparatus broke down under the strain. At once Morey shut off his apparatus, convinced by the sudden change that the pirate's apparatus had blown out. He glanced up quickly as Arcot called him. "Morey, look at him go!" Too late. Already the plane had shot off with terrific speed. It had flashed up and to their left, at a rate of climb that seemed unbelievable, except that the long trail of flaming gas told the story. The plane was propelled by rockets. The terrific acceleration carried it out of their range of vision in an instant, and as Arcot swung the ship to bring him again within sight of the windows, they gasped, for already he was many miles away. There was a terrific wrench as Arcot threw on all the power he dared, then quickly leveled the machine, following the pirate at lightning speed. He increased the acceleration further as the men grew accustomed to the force that weighed them down. Ahead of them the pirate was racing along, but quickly they were overhauling him, for his machine had wings of a sort. They produced a tremendous amount of head resistance at their present velocity, for already the needle of the radio speedometer had moved over to 1 mile a second. They were following the fleet ahead at the rate of 3,600 miles an hour. The roar of the air outside was a tremendous wave of sound, yet to them, protected by the vacuum of the double walls, it was detectable only by the vibration of the car. Rapidly the pirate's lead was cut down. It seemed but a moment before he could be within range of their machine gun. Suddenly he nosed down and shot for the ground, 10 miles below, in a power dive. Instantly, Arcot swung his machine gun in a loop that held him close to the tail of the pirate. The swift maneuvers at this speed were a terrific strain on both men and machines. The acceleration seemed crushing them with weight of 4 men, as Arcot followed the pirate in a wide loop to the right that ended in a straight climb, the rocket ship standing on its tail, the rocket blast roaring out behind a stream of fire a half-mile long. The pirate was climbing at a speed that would have distanced any other machine the world had ever seen, but the tenacious opponent behind him clung tighter than ever to the tiny darting thing. He had released great clouds of his animation suspending gas. To his utter surprise, the ship behind him had driven through it entirely unaffected. He, who knew most about the gas, had been unable to devise a material to stop it, a mask or a tank to store it. Yet in some way these men had succeeded. And that hurtling, bullet-shaped machine behind! Like some miniature airship it was, but with a speed and acceleration that put even his ship to shame. It could twist, turn, dive, rise, and shoot off on the straightaway with more flashing speed than anything aloft. Time and again he tried complicated maneuvers that strained him to the utmost, yet that machine always followed after him. There was one more thing to do. In outer space his rockets would support him. In a straight climb he shot up to the blazing sun above, out into space, while the sky around him grew black, and the stars shone in solemn splendor around him. But he had eyes for only one thing, the shining car that was rising with more than equal speed behind him. He knew he must be climbing over 2,000 miles an hour, yet the tracker came ever closer. Just out of sighting range for the new machine gun now, in a moment, but she was faltering. The men in the machine behind sat white-lipped, tense, as the whirling shocks of sudden turns at terrific speed twisted the gyroscopic seats round like peas in a rolling ball. Up, down, left, right, the darting machine ahead was twisting with unbelievable speed. Then suddenly the nose was pointed for the zenith again, and with a great column of flame shooting out behind him, he was heading straight toward space. "If he gets there, I'll lose him, Morey," said Arcot. The terrific acceleration of the climb seemed to press them to their seats with a deadly weight. It was labor to talk, but still the car shot on. Slowly they seemed to be overhauling him. Now that the velocities were perforce lowered by the efforts of gravity, and the air resistance of the atmosphere was well nigh gone, only the acceleration that the human body could stand was considered. The man ahead was pushing his plane ahead with an acceleration that would have killed many men. Slowly the acceleration of the machine was falling. Arcot pushed the control over to the last ampere, and he felt the slight surge, as a greater power rushed through the coils momentarily. Soon this was gone too, as the generator behind faltered. The driving power of the atmosphere heat was gone. More than 60 miles below them they could see the Earth as a greenish-brown surface, slightly convex, and far to the east they could distinguish a silvery line of water. But they had no eyes but for the column of shooting flame that represented the fleeing raider. Out in airless space now, he was safe from them. They could not follow. Arcot turned the plane once more parallel to Earth, watching the plane above through the roof window. Slowly the machine sank into the 50-mile level, where there was just sufficient air to maintain it in efficient operation. Well, he beat us, but there is only one thing for us to do. He must hang there on his rockets till we leave, and we can hang here indefinitely, if we can only keep this cabin decently warm. He has no air to cool him, and he has the sun to warm him. The only thing that is worrying him right now is the heat of his rockets. But he can throw most of that out with the gases. Lord, that's some machine. But eventually his rockets will give out, and down he'll come, so we'll just hang here beneath him and... Whoa, not so fast. He isn't going to stay there, it seems. He's angling his ship off a bit, and shooting along, so that, besides holding himself up, he's making a little forward progress. We have to follow. He's going to do some speeding, it seems. Well, we can keep up with him at our level. Dick, no plane ever made before would have stood the terrific pulls and yanks that this plane got. He was steering and twisting on the standard type air rudders, and what strains he had! The unique type of plane must be extremely strong. I never saw one shaped like his before, though it is the obvious shape at that. It was just a huge triangular arrowhead. Did you ever see one like it? Something like it, yes, and so have you. Don't you recognize that as the development of the old paper gliders you used to throw around as a kid? It has the same shape, the triangular wings with the point in the lead, except that he undoubtedly had a slight curve to the wings to increase the efficiency. Something like the flying wings of 50 years ago. I hope that man is only a kleptomaniac, because he can be cured of that, and I may then have a new laboratory partner. He has some exceedingly intelligent ideas. He's an ingenious man, but I wish he didn't store quite so much fuel in his rocket tubes. It's unbearably cold in here, and I can't sacrifice any power just for comfort. The rocket ship up there seems to be getting more and more acceleration in the level. He has me dropping steadily to get air to run the generator. He is going fast enough. They followed beneath the pirate, faster and faster as the rockets of the ship began to push forward more and more. Dick, why is it that he didn't use all his rockets at the first instead of gradually increasing the power this way? If you were operating the ship, Morey, you'd understand. Look at the speedometer a moment and see if you can figure it out. 4.5 miles per second. Buzzing right along. But I don't see what that... Good Lord, we'll never get him at this rate. How do you expect to get him? I have no idea yet. But you missed the important point. He's going 4.5 miles a second. When he reaches 5 miles a second, he will never come down from his 150-mile high perch. He will establish an orbit. He has so much centrifugal force that already he has very little weight. We're staying right beneath him, so we don't have much either. Well, there he goes in a last spurt. We are falling behind pretty fast. There, we're catching up now. No, we're just holding parallel. He's done it. Look! Arcot pulled out his watch and let go of it. It floated motionless in the air for a moment, then slowly drifted back toward the rear of the room. I'm using a bit of acceleration, a bit more than we need to maintain our speed. We are up high enough to make the air resistance almost nothing, even at this velocity, but we still require some power. I don't know. There was a low buzz, repeated twice. Instantly, Morey turned the dials of the radio receiving set. Again, the call signal sounded. In a moment, a voice came in, low but distinct. The power seemed fading rapidly. I'm Wade, the pirate. Help if you can. Can you get outside the atmosphere? Exceed orbital speed and fall out? I'm in orbit and I can't get out. Fuel reserve gauge stuck and I used all my rockets. No more power. Cannot slow down and fall. I'm running out of compressed air and the generator is set for going. Will take animation suspending gas. Will you be able to reach me before entering night? Quick, Morey. Answer that we will. We will try, Pirate. Think we can make it. Okay. Power about gone. The last of his power had failed. The Pirate was marooned in space. He had seen his rockets go out, leaving the exhaust tube glowing for a moment before it, too, was dark, and only the sun shining on the silvery ship made it visible. We have to hurry if we want to do anything before he reaches night. Radio the San Francisco fields that we will be coming in soon, and we need a large electromagnet, one designed to work on about 500 volts DC, and some good-sized storage cells. How many will have to be decided later, depending on the room we'll have for them. I'll start decelerating now so that we can make the turn and circle back. We are somewhere west of Hawaii, I believe, but we ought to be able to do the trick if we use all the power we can. Morey at once set to work with the radio set to raise San Francisco Airport. He was soon in communication with them, and told them that he would be there in about an hour. They promised all the necessary materials, also that they would get ready to receive the Pirate once he was finally brought to them. It was nearer an hour and a quarter later that the machine fell into the great San Francisco landing field, where the mechanics at once set to work bolting on a huge electromagnet on the landing skids on the bottom of the machine. The most serious problem was connecting the terminals electrically without making holes in the hull of the ship. Finally, one terminal was grounded, and the radio aerial used as the other. Fuller was left behind on this trip, and a large number of cells were installed in every possible position. In the power room, a hastily arranged motor generator set was arranged, making it possible to run the entire ship from the batteries. Scarcely had these been battened down to prevent sliding under the accelerations necessary, than Arcot and Morey were off. The entire operation had required about 15 minutes. "How are you going to catch him, Arcot?" "I'll overtake him going west. If I went the other way, I'd meet him going over 10 miles a second in relation to his machine. He had the right idea. He told me to fall out to him at a greater than orbital speed. I will go just within Earth's atmosphere till I get just under him, holding myself in the air by means of a downward acceleration on the part of the regular lifting power units. I am going to try to reach 8 miles a second. We will be overhauling him at 3 a second, and the ship will slow down to the right speed while falling out to him. We must reach him before he gets into the shadow of Earth, for if he reaches night he will be without heat, and he'll die of cold. I think we can reach him, Dick." "I hope so. Those spare cells are all right, aren't they?" "We'll need them. If they don't function when we get out there, we'll fall clear off into space. At 8 miles a second, we would leave Earth forever." The ship was accelerating steadily at the highest value the men aboard could stand. The needle of the speedometer crept steadily across the dial. They were flying at a height of 40 miles that they might have been enough air, and still not too greatly hindered by air resistance. The black sky above them was spotted with points of glowing light, the blazing stars of space. But as they flew along, the sensation of weight was lost. They had reached orbital speed, and as the car steadily increased its velocity, there came a strange sensation. The Earth loomed gigantic above them. Below them shone the sun. The direction of up and down was changed by the terrific speed. The needle of the speedometer was wavering at 7.8 miles a second. Now it held steady. "I thought you were going to take it up to 8 miles a second, Dick." "Air resistance is too great. I'll have to go higher." At a height of 50 miles they continued at 8.1 miles a second. It seemed hours before they reached the spot where the Pirate's machine should be flying directly above them, and they searched the black sky for some sign of the shining dot of light. With the aid of field glasses they found it, far ahead, and nearly 100 miles above. "Well, here we go. I'm going to fall up the 100 miles or so till we're right in his path. The work done against gravity will slow us down a little, so I'll have to use the power units somewhat. Did you notice what I did to them?" "Yes, they're painted dull black. What's the idea?" "We'll have no air from which to get heat for power out here, so we'll have to depend on the sunlight they can absorb. I'm using it now to slow us down as much as possible." As the tiny silver dot had grown till it became recognizable as a pirate plane, they were drawing up to it now, slowly but steadily. At last the little machine was directly beneath them, and a scant 100 yards away. They had long since been forced to run the machine on the storage batteries, and now they applied a little power to the vertical power units. Sluggishly, as they absorbed the sun's heat, the machine was forced lower, nearer to the machine below. At last, a scant 10 feet separated them. "All right, Morey." There was a snap as the temporary switch was closed, and the current surged into the big magnet on the keel. At once they felt the ship jump a little under the impulse of the magnet's pull on the smaller machine. In a moment, the little plane had drifted up to the now idle magnet, touched it, and was about to bounce off, when Morey again snapped the switch shut, and the two machines were locked firmly together. "I've got him, Dick!" Morey exclaimed. "Now slow down till it falls. Then we can go and wait for it. Being a glider, it ought to be quite manageable." Now the energy of the power units on the roof of the machine began to slow down the two machines, the magnet grinding slightly as the momentum of the plane was thrust upon it. They watched the speedometer drop. The speed was sinking very slowly, for the area of the absorbing fins was not designed to absorb the sun's heat directly, and was very inefficient. The sun was indeed sinking below their horizon. They were just beginning to watch that curious phenomenon of seeing dawn backward, when they first struck dense air enough to operate the power units noticeably. Quickly the power was applied till the machine sank rapidly into the warmer levels, the only governing factor being the tendency of the glider to break loose from the grip of the magnet. At 50 miles, the generator was started, and the heaters in the car at once became more active. There was no heat in the car below, but that was unavoidable. They would try to bring it down to warm levels quickly. "Whew, I'm glad we reached the air again, Dick. I didn't tell you sooner, for it wouldn't have done any good, but that battery was about gone. We had something like 20 amp hours left. I'm giving the recharge generator all she will take. We seem to have plenty of power now. I knew the cells were low, but I had no idea they were as low as that. I noticed that the magnet was weakening, but thought it was due to the added air strain. I am going to put the thing into a nosedive and let the glider go down itself. I know it would land correctly if it had a chance. I'm going to follow it, of course, and since we're over the middle of Siberia, we'd better start back." The return trip was necessarily in the lower level of the atmosphere, that the glider might be kept reasonably warm. At a height of but 2 miles, in the turbulent atmosphere, the glider was brought slowly home. It took them nearly 2 hours to go the short distance of 12,000 miles to San Francisco, the two men taking turns at the controls. The air resistance of the glider forced them to go slowly. They could not average much better than 600 miles an hour, in spite of the fact that the speed of either machine alone was over 1,200 miles an hour. At last the great skyscrapers of San Francisco appeared on the horizon, and thousands of private planes started out to meet them. Frantically, Arcot warned them to stay away, lest the air blast from their props tear the glider from the magnet. At last, however, the air guard was able to force them to a safe distance and clear a lane through one of the lower levels of the city traffic. The great field of the transcontinental lines was packed with excited men and women waiting to catch a glimpse of two of the greatest things the country had heard of in the century: Arcot's molecular motion machine and the Air Pirate. The landing was made safely in the circle of air guardsmen. There was a small hospital plane standing beside it in a moment, and as Arcot's ship released it, and then hung motionless, soundless above it, the people watched it in wonder and excitement. They wanted to see Arcot perform. They clamored to see the wonderful powers of this ship in operation. Air guardsmen who had witnessed the flying game of tag between these two super air machines had told of it through the press and over the radio. 2 weeks later, Arcot stepped into the office of Mr. Morey, Sr. "Busy? Come on in, you know I'm busy, but not too busy for you. What's on your mind? Wade, the pirate. Oh, I saw he reports on his lab out on the Rockies, and also the psychomedical reports on him. And most particularly, I saw the request from his employment you sent through the channels. What's your opinion of him? You've talked with him." Arcot frowned slightly. "When I talked to him, it was still two different identities dancing around in one body. Dr. Ridgely says the problem is settling down. I believe him. Ridgely's no more of a fool in his line than you and Dad are in your own lines, and Ridgely's business is healing mental wounds. We agreed some while back that the pirate must be insane, even before we met him. We also agreed that he had a tremendously competent and creative mind. As a personality in civilization, he evidently slipped several cogs. Ridgely says that is repairable. You know, Newton was off the beam for about 2 years. Faraday was a complete breakdown for 5 years, and after his breakdown came back to do some monumental work. And those men didn't have the help of modern psychomedical techniques. I think we'd be grade A fools ourselves to pass up the chance to get Wade's help. The man, insane or not, figured out a way of stabilizing and storing hydrogen for his rockets. If he could do that in the shape he was in, I'd say we'd be smart to keep the competition in the family." Mr. Morey leaned back in his chair and smiled up at Arcot. "You've got a good case there. I'll buy it. When Dr. Ridgely says Wade's got those slip cogs replaced, offer him a job on your lab staff. I'm a bit older than you are. You've grown up in a world where psychomedical techniques really work. When I was growing up, psychomedical techniques were strictly rule of thumb, and the doctors were all thumbs." Mr. Morey sighed then. "In this matter, I think your judgment is better than mine. I'll see him again and offer him the job. I'm pretty sure he'll take it, as I have said. I have a suspicion that within 6 months he'll be a lot saner than most people around. The ordinary man doesn't realize what a job of rechecking present techniques can do, and Wade is, naturally, getting a very thorough overhaul. Somewhat like a man going in for treatment of a broken arm. In any decent hospital, they'll also check for other medical problems, and he'll come out healthier than if he had never had the broken arm. Wade seems to have had a mind that made friends with molecules, and talked their language. After Ridgely shows him how to make friends with people, I think he'll be quite the man on our team." End of Chapter 4. Recording by Kirk Ziegler, Ogden, Utah, voiceover-solutions.com. Chapter 1 of The Black Star Passes by John Campbell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirk Ziegler. The lights of Great Transcontinental Airport were blazing in cheery splendor. Out there in the center of the broad field, a dozen men were silhouetted in the white brilliance, looking up at the sky, where the stars winked cold and clear on the jet background of the frosty night. A slim crescent moon gleamed in the west, a sickle of light that in no way dimmed the cold flame of the brilliant stars. One point of light now moved across the motionless field of far-off suns, flashing toward the airport in a long, swift curve. The men on the field murmured and pointed up as it swept low over the blazing lights of New York. Lower it swooped, the towering city behind it. Half a mile into the air the buildings rose in a shiny glory of colored tile that shone brightly in the sweeping play of floodlights. One of them picked out the descending machine. It suddenly leapt out of the darkness as a shining, streamlined cylinder, a cylinder with a great halo of blue fire as the beam of the searchlight set it off from the jet black night. In moments the ship was vast before the eyes of the waiting men. It had landed gently on the field, was floating smoothly, gracefully towards them. 24 men climbed from the great ship, shivering in the icy blast that swept across the field, spoke a moment with the group awaiting their arrival, then climbed quickly into the grateful warmth of the field car. In a moment they were speeding toward the light of the field house half a mile off. Behind them the huge ship leapt into the sky, then suddenly pointed its nose up at an angle of 30 degrees and shot high into the air at an unbelievable speed. In an instant it was gone. At the field house, the party broke up almost immediately. "We want to thank you, Mr. Morey, for your demonstration of the new ship tonight, and you, Dr. Arcot, for answering our many questions about it. I am sure we all appreciate the kindness you have shown the press." The reporters filed out quickly, anxious to get the news into the morning editions. It was after 1 o'clock now. Each received a small slip of paper from the attendant standing at the exit, the official statement of the company. At last all had left but the 6 men who were responsible for the new machine. This night had witnessed the official demonstration of the first of Arcot Morey molecular motion ships. Small as she was, compared to those that were to come, yet she could carry over 3,000 passengers, as many as could any existing winged plane, and her speed was immensely greater. The trip from the west coast to the eastern had been made in less than 1 hour. At a speed close to 1 mile a second, the great ship had shot through the thin air, 25 miles above the Earth. In this vessel, a huge bar of metal could be affected by an ultra-high frequency generator. When so affected, its molecules all moved forward, taking the ship with them. Thus, a molecular motion drive vessel could, theoretically, approach the velocity of light as a limit. "Arcot," said Morey Senior after the pressman had left the room, "as president of this company, I certainly want to thank you for the tremendous thing you have given us to use. You have sold us this machine, but how can we repay you? Before this, time and time again, you have sold us your inventions, the ideas that have made it possible for Transcontinental to attain its present high position in world transportation. All you have ever accepted is the laboratory you use, its upkeep, and a small annual income. What can we do to show our appreciation this time?" "Why," answered Arcot, smiling, "you haven't stated the terms correctly. Actually, I have a fully equipped lab to putter around in all the time I want for my own amusement, and all the money I want. What more could I ask?" "I suppose that's all true, but you draw only about $600,000 a year for personal expenses. A good clerk could get that, and you, admittedly the most brilliant physicist on Earth, are satisfied. I don't feel we are paying you properly." Arcot's expression became suddenly serious. "You can repay me this time," he said, "for this latest discovery has made a new thing possible. I've always wanted to be able to visit other planets, as many a scientist for the last 3 centuries. This machine has made it possible. If you're willing, we could start by the spring of 2117. I'm quite serious about this. With your permission, I want to start work on the first interplanetary ship. I'll need Fuller's help, of course. The proposition will be expensive, and that's where I must ask you to help me. I think, however, that it may be a paying proposition, at that, for there will certainly be something of commercial value on the other planets." They had walked out to the shed where Arcot's private molecular motion car stood, the first machine ever built that used the heat of the sun to drive it. Thoughtfully, the president of the great transcontinental lines looked at it. It was small compared with the great machine that had just brought them east, but of the same swift type. It was a thing of graceful beauty even on the ground, its long curving streamlines giving it wonderful symmetry. They stood in thoughtful silence for a minute, the young men eager to hear the verdict of their prospective backer. Morey, always rather slow of speech, took an unusually long time to answer. "If it were only money you asked for, Arcot, I'd gladly give you double the sum. But that isn't the case. I know perfectly well that if you do go, my son will go with you, and Fuller and Wade will naturally go too." He looked at each of them in turn. "Each of you has come to mean a lot to me. You and Fuller have known Bob since college days. I've known Wade only 3 months, but every day I grow to like him more. There's no denying the fact that any such trip is a terrifically dangerous proposition. But if you were lost, there would be more than my personal loss. We would lose some of the most brilliant men on Earth. You, for instance, are conceded as being the world's most brilliant physicist. Fuller is one of the greatest designing engineers. Wade is rapidly rising to prominence as a chemist and physicist. And my son is certainly a good mathematician." He paused, frowning, weighing the situation. "But you men should know how to get out of scrapes just that much better. Certainly there are few men on Earth who would not be willing to back such a group of men, or any one of you for that matter. I'll back your trip." His words became more facetious. "I know that Arcot and you, Bob, can handle a gun fairly well. I don't know so much about Wade and Fuller. What experience have you two had?" Fuller shook his head. "I think I'll best fit in the galley on the trip, Mr. Morey. I've done the cooking on a number of camping trips, and food is an important factor in the success of any expedition. I can shoot a bit too." Wade spoke rather hesitantly. "I come from the West, and have had a good bit of fun with a gun in the Rockies. There are still some mountain lions and some deer there, you know. I also have a sneaking acquaintance with the new gun, which Arcot developed in connection with its molecular motion. But there's so little you know about me, and most of it bad. I don't see how I really get in on this opportunity, but," he added hastily, "I certainly don't intend to keep the old boy knocking. I'm with you since I'm invited." Arcot smiled. "Then you'll definitely support us?" "Yes, I will," replied Morey Senior seriously, "for I think it's worth doing." The four men climbed into the ship to start for their apartment. Arcot was piloting, and under his sure touch the ship sped out into the cold night air, then up through the atmosphere till they hung poised at a height of 50 miles on the upper edge of an airy blanket. They looked out in silent thought at the magnificent blazing stars of space. Here, where the dust-laden air could no longer mask their true colors, the stars shone winkingly, steadily, and in a glory that earthbound men had never seen before. They shone in a wondrous riot of color, as varied and as beautiful as the display of colored floodlights in some great city. They were tiny pinpoints of radiance, red, green, orange and yellow, shining with intense brilliance. Slowly Arcot let the machine settle into the blazing city miles below. "I've come to love it out here, and look at these cold pinpoint lights. They seem to draw me, the lure of other worlds. I've always had a sense of unfulfilled longing, the desire to go out there, and it's always been so hopeless. Now I'll be out there by next spring." Arcot paused and looked up at the mighty field of stars that arched over his head to be lost on either horizon. A wonderful night. "Where shall we go first, Dick?" asked Wade softly as he gazed out at the far-off suns of space, his voice unconsciously hushed by the grandeur of the spectacle. "I've thought of that for the last 4 months, and now we are definitely going to go. We'll have to make a decision. Actually, it won't be too hard to decide. Of course, we can't leave the solar system, and the outer planets are so far away, I think we had better wait till later trips. That leaves the choice really between Mars, Venus, and Mercury. Mercury isn't practical since it's so close to the sun. We know a fair bit about Mars from telescopic observation, while Venus, wrapped in a perpetual cloud, is a mystery. What do you vote?" "Well," said Morey, "it seems to me it's more fun to explore a completely unknown planet than one that can be observed telescopically. I vote Venus." Each of the others agreed with Morey that Venus was the logical choice. By this time the machine had sunk into the roof of their apartment, and the men disembarked and entered. The next day they were to start the actual work of designing the spaceship. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Kirk Ziegler, Ogden, Utah. voiceover-solutions.com. Chapter 2 of The Black Star Passes by John Campbell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirk Ziegler. "When we start this work," Arcot began the next morning, "we obviously want to design the ship for the conditions we expect to meet, and for minimum convenience and safety. I believe I've thought about this trip longer than the rest of you, so I'll present my ideas first. We don't actually know anything about conditions on Venus, since no one has actually been there. Venus is probably a younger planet than Earth. It's far nearer the sun than we are, and it gets twice the heat we do. In the long time gone when the planets were cooling, I believe Venus required far longer than Earth, for the inpouring heat would retard its cooling. The surface temperature is probably about 150 degrees Fahrenheit. There is little land, Probably, for with the cloud mass covering Venus as it does, it's logical to visualize tremendous seas. What life has developed must be largely aquatic, and the land is probably far behind us in evolution. Of course, Venus is the planet of mystery. We don't know. We can only guess. But do we know what things we are going to need to cross space? Obviously, the main driving force will be the power units. These will get their energy from the rays of the sun by absorbing them in copper discs about 12 feet in diameter. The ship will have to be more of a disc than a cylinder. I think a ship 180 feet long, 50 feet wide, and 20 feet deep will be about the best dimensions. The power units will be strung along the top of the ship in double rows, one down each side of the hull. In the middle will be a series of fused quartz windows, opening into a large room just under the outer shell. We'll obviously need some source power to activate the power tubes that run the molecular motion power units. We'll have a generator run by molecular motion power units in here, absorbing its heat from the atmosphere in this room. The air will be heated by the rays of the sun, of course, and in this way we'll get all our power from the sun itself. Since this absorption of energy might result in making the ship too cool, due to the radiation of the side away from the sun, we'll polish it, and thus reduce the unlighted side's radiation. The power units will not be able to steer us in space, due to their position, and those on the sides, which will steer us in the atmosphere by the usual method, will be unable to get the sun's power. They'll be shaded. For steering in space, we'll use atomic hydrogen rockets, storing the atomic gas by the Wade method in tanks in the hold. We'll also have a battery down there for starting the generator and for emergencies. For protection against meteors, we'll use radar. If anything comes within a dozen miles of us, the radar unit covering that sector will at once set automatic machinery in operation, and the rockets will shoot the ship out of the path of the meteor. All that day, Arcot and the others discussed the various pieces of apparatus they would need, and toward evening, Fuller began to draw rough sketches of the different mechanisms that had been agreed upon. The next day, by late afternoon, they had planned the rough details of the ship and had begun the greater task of calculating the stresses and the power factors. "We won't need any tremendous strength for the ship while it's in space," Arcot commented, "for then there will be little strain on it. It will be weightless from the start, and the gentle acceleration will not strain it in the least. But we must have strength so it can maneuver in the atmosphere. We'll leave Earth by centrifugal force, for I can make much better speed in the atmosphere where there is plenty of power to draw on. Outside, I must depend solely on sunlight. We'll circle the Earth, forming an orbit just within the atmosphere, at 5 miles a second. We'll gradually increase speed to about 10 miles a second, at which point the ship would normally fly off into space under its own centrifugal force. With the power units, we'll prevent this release until the proper moment. When we release it, it will be entirely free of Earth, and no more work will be needed to overcome Earth's pull." The planning continued with exasperating slowness. The details of the work were complex, for all the machines were totally new. Several weeks passed before even the power units could be ordered, and the first work on the ship started. After that, orders for materials left the office daily. Still, it was late in November before the last order was sent out. Now they must begin work on other phases of the expedition. Food supplies and the standard parts of equipment. In the interval, Arcot had decided to make a special ventilated suit for use on Venus. This was to make use of a small molecular motion director apparatus to cool the air and blow it through the suit. The apparatus consisted of a small compressed air-driven generator and a power tube bank that could be carried on the back. "Arcot," Wade said when he saw the apparatus completed and the testing machine ready, "I've just noticed how similar this is to the portable invisibility apparatus I developed as the Pirate. I wonder if it might not be handy at times to be invisible. We could incorporate that with a slight change. It wouldn't add any more than 5 pounds. And those tubes you're using, I'm sure, are easily strong enough to carry the extra load." "Great idea, Wade," said Arcot. It might be very useful if we meet hostile natives. The disappearance stunt might make us gods or something to primitive beings. And now that you mention it, I think we can install the apparatus in the ship. It will require almost no power, and might save our lives sometime." The work went forward steadily at the great transcontinental shops where the spaceship was being built. Its construction was being kept as much of a secret as possible, for Arcot feared the interference of the crowds that would be sure to collect if the facts were known, and since the shops directly joined the airfield, it meant that there would be helicopters buzzing about the transatlantic and transcontinental planes. The work to be done required the most careful manipulation and workmanship, for one defect could mean death. They calculated 6 weeks for the trip, and in the time before they could reach either planet, much might happen to a crippled ship. To the men who were making the trip, the waiting seemed most exasperating, and they spent the days before they could begin the installation of the electrical apparatus in purchasing the necessary standard equipment, the standard coils, tubes, condensers, the canned food supplies, clothes, everything they could imagine as a possible utility. They were making the ship with a great deal of storage space, for Arcot hoped the trip would be a financial success, particularly supplying much needed metals. Many vital elements are already excessively scarce, and no satisfactory substitutes had been found. On the outward trip, some of this space would be filled with the many things they would consume en route. In addition, they were carrying a great many spare parts, spare tubes, spare power units, spare condensers, 1,001 odd parts. Arcot intended that they should be able to make an entire new power switchboard and motion director unit if anything should go wrong, and he certainly had all the apparatus. At last, the day came when the final connection had been soldered, and the last joint welded. The atomic hydrogen tanks were full, and under the ship's own power, oxygen tanks were filled and the batteries charged. They were ready for a test flight. The great ship rested on the floor of the shed now, awaiting the start. "Oh, fellows, come here a minute," Arcot called to the other members of the party. "I want to show you something." The three walked quickly to the bow where Arcot stood, and following the line of his vision, looked in wonder to see that everything was right. They watched curiously as he drew from his coat a large glass bottle tightly sealed. "What's that for?" asked Wade curiously. "We're about to start on the first cruise, and I've been wondering if it isn't time we gave the ship a name." "Great! I'd been thinking of that too. What are we going to name her?" "Well," said Arcot, "I had been thinking of Alexander. He longed for other worlds to conquer." "Not bad," Morey commented. "I've been thinking of naming it too. I guess we all have. But I was thinking of Santa Maria, the first ship to discover the new world." "I was thinking more of its home," said Wade. "How about calling it Terrestrian?" "Well, it's your turn, Fuller. You designed it. What do you suggest for your masterpiece?" asked Arcot. "I was thinking also of its home, the home it will never leave. I'd like to think that we might find people on Venus, and I would like to have a name on it that might be translatable into more friendly and less foreign terms. Why not call it Solarite?" "Solarite, a member of the solar system. It will be that always. It will be a world unto itself when it makes its trips. It will take up an orbit about the sun, a true member of the solar system. I like it." Arcot turned to the others. "How about it?" It was agreed upon unanimously. "But I'm still curious about that glass bottle so carefully sealed," Morey commented with a puzzled smile. "What's in it? Some kind of gas?" "No, wrong. No gas. Practically nothing at all, in fact. What more appropriate for christening a spaceship than a bottle of hard vacuum? We can't have a pretty girl christen this ship, that's sure. A flying bachelor's apartment christened by a mere woman? Never. We will have the foreman of the works here do that. Since we can't have the ship slide down the ways or anything, we will get inside and move it when he smashes the bottle. But in the meantime, let's have a symbol set in contrasting metal on the bow. We can have the blazing sun with 9 planets circling it, and the Earth indicated conspicuously. And below that, the word solarite. End of chapter 2. Recording by Kirk Ziegler, Ogden, Utah. voiceover-solutions.com. Chapter 3 of The Black Star Passes by John Campbell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirk Ziegler. It was shortly after noon when the newly christened solarite left on its first trip into space. The sun was a great ball of fire low in the west when they returned. Dropping plummet-like from the depths of space, the rush of air about the hull, a long scream that mounted from a half-heard sound in the outer limit of the Earth's atmosphere, to a roar of tortured air as the ship dropped swiftly to the field and shot into the hangar. Instantly the crew darted to the side of the great cylinder as the door of the ship opened. Fuller appeared in the opening, and at the first glimpse of his face, the hangar crew knew something was wrong. "Hey, Jackson," Fuller called. "Get the field doctor. Arcot had a little accident out there in space." In moments, the man designated returned with the doctor, leading him swiftly down the long metal corridor to Arcot's room aboard. There was a mean-looking cut in Arcot's scalp, but a quick, sure examination by the doctor revealed that there appeared to be no serious injury. He had been knocked unconscious by the blow that made the cut, and he had not yet recovered his senses. "How did this happen?" asked the doctor as he bathed the cut and deftly bandaged it. Morey explained. "There's a device aboard whose job it is to get us out of the way of stray meteors, and it works automatically. Arcot and I were just changing places at the controls. While neither of us was strapped into our seats, a meteor came within range, and the rocket tubes shot the car out of the way. We both went tumbling head over heels, and Arcot landed on his ear. I was luckier, and was able to break my fall with my hands, but it was a mean fall. At our speed we had about double weight, so though it was only about 7 feet, we might as well fallen 14. We took turns piloting the ship, and Arcot was about to bring us back when that shock just about shook us all over the ship. We will have to make some changes. It does its job, but we need warning enough to grab hold." The doctor was through now, and he began to revive his patient. In a moment he stirred and raised his hands to feel the sore spot. In 10 minutes he was conversing with his friends, apparently none the worse except for a very severe headache. The doctor gave him a mild opiate and sent him to bed, to sleep off the effects of the blow. With the ship fully equipped, tested, and checked in every possible way, the time for leaving was set for the following Saturday, 3 days off. Great supplies of stores had to be carried aboard in the meantime. Care had to be exercised in this work, lest the cargo slip free under varying acceleration of the solarite, and batter itself to bits, or even wreck some vital part of the ship. At noon on the chosen day, the first ship ever to leave the bounds of Earth's gravity was ready to start. Gently the heavily laden solarite rose from the hangar floor, and slowly floated out into the bright sunshine of the early February day. Beside it rode the little ship that Arcot had first built, piloted by the father of the inventor. With him rode the elderly Morey and a dozen newsmen. The little ship was badly crowded now as they slowly rose, high into the upper reaches of the Earth's atmosphere. The sky about them was growing dark. They were going into space. At last they reached the absolute ceiling of the smaller ship, and it hung there while the solarite went a few miles higher. Then slowly, but ever faster and faster, they were plunging ahead, gathering speed. They watched the radio speedometer creep up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Steadily it rose as the acceleration pressed them hard against the back of the seats. 8, 9. Still it rose as the hum of the generator became a low snarl. 10, 11, 12. They were rocketing at 12 miles a second, the tenuous air about the ship shrieking in a thin scream of protest as it parted on the streamlined bow. Slowly the speed rose, reached 15 miles a second. The sun's pull became steadily more powerful. They were falling toward the fiery sphere, away from the Earth. A microphone recessed in the outer wall brought them the fading whisper of air from outside. Arcot shouted a sudden warning. "Hold on! We're going to lose all weight! Out into space!" There was a click, and the angry snarl of the overhead generator died in an instant as the thudding relays cut it out of the circuit. Simultaneously the air scoop which had carried the air into the generator switched off, transferring to the solar heat as a source of power. They seemed to be falling with terrific and ever-increasing speed. They looked down, saw the Earth shrinking visibly as they shot away at more than 5 miles a second. They were traveling 15 miles a second ahead and 5 a second straight up. The men watched with intense interest as the heavens opened up before them. They could see the stars now, a scant degree from the sun itself, for no air diffused its blinding glory. The heat of the rays seemed to burn them. There was a prickling pleasantness to it now, as they looked at the mighty sea of flame through smoke glasses. The vast arms of the corona reached out like tentacles of some fiery octopus through thousands of miles of space. Huge arms of flaming gas that writhed out as though to reach and drag back the whirling planets to the parent body. All about the mighty sphere, stretching far into space, a wan glow seemed to ebb and flow, a kaleidoscope of swiftly changing color. It was the zodiacal light, an aurora borealis on a scale inconceivable. Arcot worked rapidly with the controls, the absence of weight that gave that continued sense of unending fall aiding him and his assistants in their rapid setting of the controls. At last the work was done, and the ship flashed on its way under the control of the instruments that would guide it across all the millions of miles of space, and landed on Venus with unerring certainty. The photoelectric telescopic eye watched the planet constantly, keeping the ship surely and accurately on course that would get them to the distant planet in the shortest possible time. The work thereafter became routine, requiring a minimum of effort, and the men could rest and use their time to observe the beauties of the skies as no man had ever seen them during all the billions of years of time that this solar system has existed. The lack of atmosphere made it possible to use a power of magnification that no terrestrial telescope may use. The blurred outlines produced by the shifting air prohibits magnifications of more than a few thousand diameters. But here in space they could use the greatest power of their telescope. With it they could look at Mars and see it more clearly than any other man had ever seen it, despite the fact that it was now over 200 million miles away. But though they spent much time taking photographs of the planets and of the moon, and in making spectrum analysis of the sun, time passed very slowly. Day after day they saw measured on the clocks, but they stayed awake, finding they needed little sleep, for they wasted no physical energy. Their weightlessness eliminated fatigue. However, they determined that during the 12 hours before reaching Venus they must be thoroughly alert, so they tried to sleep in pairs. Arcot and Morey were the first to seek slumber, but Morpheus seemed to be a mundane god, for he did not reward them. At last it became necessary for them to take a mild opiate, for their muscles refused to permit their tired brains to sleep. It was 12 hours later when they awoke, to relieve Wade and Fuller. They spent most of the 12 hours of their routine watching and playing games of chess. There was little to be done. The silver globe before them seemed unchanging, for they were still so far away it seemed little larger than the moon does when seen from Earth. But at last it was time for the effects of the mild drug to wear off, and for Wade and Fuller to awaken from their sleep. "Morey, I have an idea." There was an expression of perfect innocence on Arcot's face, but a twinkle of humor in his eyes. "I wonder if it might not be interesting to observe the reactions of a man waking suddenly from sleep to find himself alone in space?" He stared thoughtfully at the control that would make the ship perfectly transparent, perfectly invisible. "I wonder if it would," said Morey, grasping Arcot's idea. "What do you say we try it?" Arcot turned the little switch, and where there had been a ship, it was no more. It was gone! Fuller stirred uneasily in his bed, tightly strapped as he was. The effects of the drug were wearing off. Sleepily he yawned, stretched, and blindly, his heavy eyes still closed, released the straps that held him in bed. Yawning widely, he opened his eyes, with a sudden start, sat upright. Then, with an excellent imitation of an Indian on the warpath, he leaped from his bed and started to run wildly across the floor. His eyes were raised to the place where the ceiling should have been. He called lustily in alarm, then suddenly he was flying up, and crashed heavily against the ceiling. His face was a picture of utter astonishment as he fell lightly to the floor. Then slowly it changed, and took on a chagrined smile. He understood. He spun around as loud cries suddenly resounded from Wade's room across the hall. Then there was a dull thud, as he too, forgetting the weightlessness, jumped and hit the ceiling. Then the cries were gone, like the snuffing of a candle. From the control room there rose loud laughter, and a moment later they felt more normal, as they again saw the four strong walls about them. Wade sighed heavily and shook his head. They were approaching the planet visibly now. In the 12 hours that passed they had covered 1,000,000 miles, for now they were falling toward the planet under its attraction. It glowed before them now in wondrous splendor, a mighty disk of molten silver. For the last 24 hours they had been reducing their speed relative to Venus, to ensure their forming an orbit about the planet, rather than shoot around it and back into space. Their velocity had been over 100 miles a second part of the way, but now it had been reduced to 10. The gravity of the planet was urging them forward at ever increasing speed, and their problem became more acute moment by moment. "We'll never make it on the power units alone out here in space," said Arcot seriously. "We'll just shoot around the planet. I'll tell you how we can do it, though. We'll circle around it, entering its atmosphere on the daylight side, and shoot into the upper limits of its atmosphere. There the power units can find some heat to work on, and we can really slow down. But we'll have to use the rocket tubes to get the acceleration we'll need to drive the ship into the air." There was a sudden clanging of a bell, and everyone dived for a hold, and held on tightly. An instant later there was a terrific wrench as the rocket jets threw the plane out of the way of a meteor. "We're getting near a planet. This is the third meteor we've met since we were more than 1,000,000 miles from Earth. Venus and Earth and all the planets act like giant vacuum cleaners of space, pulling into themselves all the space debris and meteors within millions of miles of their gravitational attraction. Swiftly the planet expanded below them, growing vaster with each passing moment. It had been changing from a disk to a globe. Now, as the molten silver of its surface seemed swiftly clouding, it turned gray. Then they saw its true appearance, a vast field of rolling, billowing clouds. The solarite was shooting around the planet now at 10 miles a second, far more than enough to carry them away from the planet again, out into space once more if their speed was not checked. "Hold on, everybody," Arcot called. "We're going to turn toward the planet now." He depressed a small lever. There was a sudden shock, and all the space about them seemed to burst into huge, deep red atomic hydrogen flames. The solarite reeled under the sudden pressure, but the heavy gyroscopic stabilizers caught it, held it, and the ship remained on even keel. Then suddenly there came to the ears of the men a long drawn whine, faint, almost inaudible, and the ship began slowing down. The solarite had entered the atmosphere of Venus, the first man-made machine to thus penetrate the air of another world. Quickly Arcot snapped open the control that had kept the rockets flaming, turning the ship to the planet, diving it into the atmosphere. Now they could get their power from the air that each instant grew more dense about them. "Wade, in the power room. Emergency control post. Morey, control board there. Hang on, for we'll have to use some husky accelerations." Instantly the two men sprang to their posts, literally diving, for they were still almost weightless. Arcot pulled another lever. There was a dull snap as the relay in the power room responded. The lights wavered, dimmed, then the generator was once more humming smoothly, working on the atmosphere of Venus. In a moment the power units were operating again. And now, as they sucked a plenitude of power from the surrounding air, they produced a force that made the men cling onto their holds with almost frantic force. Around them, the rapidly increasing density of the air made the whine grow to a roar. The temperature within the ship rose slowly, warmed by friction with the air. Despite the extreme cold at this altitude, more than 75 miles above the surface of the planet, they began dropping rapidly now. Their radio speedometer had fallen from 10 to 9, then slowly, but faster and faster, as more heat could be extracted from the air, it had fallen 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. Now they were well below orbital speed, falling under the influence of the planet. The struggle was over. The men relaxed. The ship ran quietly now, the smooth hum of the air rushing over the great power units coming softly through the speaker to their ears, a humming melody, the song of a new world. End of Chapter 3. Recording by Kirk Ziegler, Ogden, Utah. voiceover-solutions.com. Chapter 4 of The Black Star Passes by John Campbell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirk Ziegler. Suddenly the sun was gone, and they were floating in a vast world of rolling mists. Mists that brushed the car with tiny clicks, which with the millions of particles that struck simultaneously merged into a steady roar. "Ice? Clouds? Ice! Clouds!" Morey exclaimed. Arcot nodded. "We'll drop below the clouds. They're probably miles deep. Look, already they're changing. Snow now. In a moment there will be water. Then it'll clear away and we'll actually see Venus." For 10 miles, an endless distance it seemed, they dropped through the clouds utterly impenetrable to the eye. Then gradually the clouds thinned. There appeared brief clear spots, spots into which they could see short distances. Then here and there they caught glimpses of green below. Was it water or land? With a suddenness that startled them, they were out of the clouds, shooting smoothly and swiftly above a broad plain. It seemed to stretch for endless miles across the globe, to be lost in the far distance to east and west. But to the north they saw a low range of hills that rose blue and misty in the distance. "Venus! We made it!" Morey cried jubilantly. "The first men ever to leave Earth! I'm going to start the old sender and radio back home. Man, look at that stretch of plain!" He jumped to his feet and started across the control room. "Lord, I feel like a ton of lead now. I'm sure out of condition for walking after all that time just floating." Arcot raised a restraining hand. "Whoa, wait a minute there, Morey. You won't get anything through to them now. The Earth is on the other side of Venus. It's on the night side, remember? And we're on the day side. In about 12 hours we'll be able to send a message. In the meantime, take the controls while I make a test of the air here, will you?" Relieved of the controls, Arcot rose and walked down the corridor to the power room where the chemical laboratory had been set up. Wade had already collected a dozen samples of air, and was working on them. "How is it? What have you tested for so far?" asked Arcot. "Oxygen and CO2. The oxygen is about 22%, or considering the slightly lower air pressure here, we will just have to adjust about the right amount of oxygen. The CO2 is about 0.1%. The atmosphere is okay for terrestrial life apparently. That mouse there is living quite happily. Whatever the other 75% or so of diluting gas is, I don't know, but it isn't nitrogen." Briefly, Arcot and Wade discussed the unusual atmosphere, finally deciding that the inert gas was argon. "No great amount of nitrogen," Arcot concluded. "That means that life will have a sweet time extracting it from the air, but wherever there is life, it finds a way to do the impossible. Test it more accurately, will you? You try for nitrogen, and I'll try the component inert gases." They ran the analyses rapidly, and in a very short time, less than an hour, their results stood at 23% oxygen, 0.1% carbon dioxide, 68% argon, 6% nitrogen, 2% helium, 5% neon, 0.05% hydrogen, and the rest krypton and xenon apparently. The analysis of these inert gases had to be done rather roughly in this short time, but it was sufficient to balance fairly accurately. The two chemists reported back to the control cabin. "Well, we'll be able to breathe the atmosphere of Venus with ease. I believe we can go on now. I've been surprised to see no water in sight, but I think I see my mistake now. You know, the Mississippi has a mouth farther from the center of the Earth than its source. It flows uphill. The answer is, of course, the centrifugal force of the Earth's spin impels it to flow that way. Similarly, I am sure now that we will find that Venus has a vast belt of water about the middle, and to the north and south there will be two great caps of dry land. We are on the northern cap. We have the microphone turned way down. Let's step up the power a bit and see if there's any sound outside," said Arcot, and walked over to the power control switch. An instant later a low hum came from the loudspeaker. There was a light breeze blowing in. In the distance, forming a dull background for the hum, there came a low rumbling that seemed punctuated now by the greater sound. "Must be a long way off," said Arcot, a puzzled frown on his face. "Swing the ship around so we can see in what direction the sound is the loudest," he suggested. Slowly Morey swung the ship around on its vertical axis. Without a doubt something was off in the direction of the hills was making a considerable noise. "Arcot, if that's a fight between two animals, two of those giant animals that you said might be here, I don't care to get near them." Fuller's narrowed eyes strove to penetrate the haze that screened the low hills in the blue distance. The microphone was shut off while the solarite shot swiftly forward toward the source of the sound. Quickly the hills grew, the blue mistiness disappearing, and the jagged mounds revealing themselves as bleak, harsh rock. As they drew nearer, they saw beyond the hills, intermittent flashes of brilliant light, heard shattering blasts of sound. "A thunderstorm!" Wade began, but Arcot interrupted. "Not so fast, Wade. Fuller's animal is there, the only animal in all creation that can make noise like that. Look through the telescope. See those dots wheeling about there above the flashing lights? The only animal that can make that racket is man. There are men over there, and aren't they in a playful mood? Turn on the invisibility while we can, Morey. Let's get nearer. Look out, here we go." Morey began to close a tiny switch in one side of the instrument panel. Then, before the relay below could move, he had flipped it back. "Here, you take it, Arcot. You always think about 2 steps ahead of me. You're quicker, and you know the machine better anyway." Quickly the two men exchanged places. "I don't know about that, Morey," said a voice from vacancy, for Arcot had at once thrown the ship into invisibility. "The longer we're here, the more mistakes I see we make in our calculations. I see what put me off so badly on my estimate of the intelligence of life found here. The sun gives it a double dose of heat, but there's also a double dose of other radiations, some of which evidently speed up evolution. Anyway, we may be able to find friends here more quickly if we aid one side or the other in the very lively battle going on there. Before we go any further, what's our decision?" "I think it's a fine idea," said Fuller. "But which side are we to aid? And what are the sides? We haven't even seen them yet." "Let's go nearer and take a good look." "Yes, but are we going to join either side after looking?" "Oh, that's unanimous," said Wade excitedly. The invisible ship darted forward. They sped past the barrier of the low hills, and were again high above a broad plain. With a startled gasp, Arcot cut their speed. There, floating high in the air, above a magnificent city, was a machine such as no man had ever before seen. It was a titanic airplane, monstrous, gargantuan, and every other word that denoted immensity. Fully 3/4 of a mile, the huge metal wing stretched out in the dull light of the cloudy Venerian day. A machine that seemed to dwarf even the vast city beneath it. The roar of its mighty propellers was a rumbling thunder to the men in the solarite. From it came the flashing bursts of flame. On closer inspection, the watchers saw that it seemed to be a swarm of tiny gnats flying about the mighty plane. They appeared to be attacking the giant as vainly as gnats might attack an eagle, for they could not damage the giant machine. The flashing bombs burst in blasts of yellow flame as harmlessly as so many firecrackers. All that mighty plane was covered with heavy metal plates, fully 10 inches thick, and of metal so tough that when the powerful bombs hit it, they made no impression, though they blasted tremendous craters in the soil below. From it poured a steady stream of bombs that burst with a great flash of heat and light, and in an instant the tiny planes they struck streaked down as incandescent masses of metal. Yet the giant seemed unable to approach the city. Or was it defending it? No, for it was from the city that the vainly courageous little ships poured out. But certainly it was not these ships that kept the titanic battleship of the air at bay. Tensely the men watched the uneven conflict. The rain of bombs continued, though all fell short of the city. But slowly around the metropolis there appeared an area of flaring, molten lava, and steadily this moved toward the beautiful buildings. Suddenly the battleship turned toward the city and made a short dash inward on its circling path. As though awaiting this maneuver, a battery of hissing, flaming swords of white light flashed upward, a few hundred feet from the ring of the molten rock. As the titanic plane rolled, sides slipped out of the way, they passed harmlessly, barely missing a monstrous wing. "Which?" Arcot demanded. "I say the city. No one should destroy anything so magnificent." Not a dissenting voice was raised, so Arcot sent the solarite nearer. "But what in the world can we do with that huge thing?" Fuller's voice came eerily out of the emptiness. "It has perfect invulnerability through its size alone." There was a sudden silence among the Terrestrials, as one of the tiny planes darted forward and dove at full speed directly toward one of the giant propellers. There were 50 of these strung along each great wing. If enough of them could be destroyed, the plane must crash. There came a terrific crash, a flare of light, and splintered fragments of flaming wreckage plummeted down. Yet the mighty blades continued whirling as smoothly as ever. What could the solarite do against the giant monoplane? Evidently Arcot had a plan. Under his touch, their machine darted high into the sky above the great plane. There was a full mile between them when he released the sustaining force of the solarite and let it drop, straight toward the source of the battle, falling freely, ever more and more rapidly. They were rushing at the mighty plane below at a pace that made their hearts seem to pause. Then suddenly Arcot cried out, "Hold on! Here we stop!" They seemed a scant 100 feet from the broad metal wings of the unsuspecting plane when suddenly there was a tremendous jerk, and each man felt himself pressed into the floor beneath a terrific weight that made their backs crack with the load. Doggedly they fought to restrain their senses. The blackness receded. Below them they saw only a mighty sea of roaring red flames, a hell of blazing gas that roared like a score of bombs set off at once. The solarite was sitting down on her rocket jets. All 6 of the rocket tubes in the base of the ship had been opened wide, and streaming from them in a furious blast of incandescent gas, the atomic hydrogen shot out in a mighty column of gas at 3,500 degrees centigrade. Where the gas touched, the great plane flared to incandescence, and in an immeasurable interval the fall of the solarite ended, and it rebounded high into the air. Arcot, struggling against the weight of 6 gravities, pulled shut the little control that had sent those mighty torches blasting out, and an instant later they sped away lest the plane shoot toward the gas columns. From a safe distance they looked back at their work. No longer was the mighty plane unscathed, invulnerable, for now in its top gaped 6 great craters of incandescent metal that almost touched and coalesced. The great plane itself reeled, staggering, plunging downward, but long before it reached the hard soil below, it was brought into level flight, and despite many dead engines, it circled and fled toward the south. The horde of small planes followed, dropping a rain of bombs into the growing pits in the ship, releasing their fury in its interior. In moments, the beings manning the Marauder had to a large extent recovered from the shock of the attack and were fighting back. In a moment, just before the ship passed over the horizon and out of sight, the Terrestrian saw the great props that had been idle suddenly leap into motion, and in an instant the giant had left its attackers behind, fleeing from its invisible foe. Under Arcot's guidance, the ship from Earth, still invisible, returned to the approximate spot where they had destroyed the invulnerability of the giant. Then suddenly, out of nothing, the solarite appeared. In an instant, a dozen of the tiny 2-man planes darted toward it. Just as they might recognize it, Arcot shot it up a bit higher with the aid of the keel rockets at 1/3 power. The typical reddish flame of atomic hydrogen he knew would be instantaneously recognizable. Little these planes were, but shaped like darts, and swifter than any plane of Earth. They shot along at 1,000 miles an hour readily, as Arcot soon found out. It was not a minute before they had formed a long line that circled the solarite at minimum speed, then started off in the direction of the city. On impulse, Arcot followed after them, and instantly the planes increased their velocity, swiftly reaching 1,000 miles per hour. The city they were approaching was an inspiring sight. Mighty towers swept graceful lines a half mile in the air, their brightly colored walls gleaming in rainbow hues, giving the entire city the aspect of a gigantic jewel. A single architectural unit. Here was symmetry and order, with every unit in the city built around the gigantic central edifice that rose, a tremendous tower of black and gold, a full mile in the air. The outer parts of the city were evidently the residential districts, the low buildings and the wide streets with little green lawns showing the care of the individual owner. Then came the apartment houses and the small stores. These rose in gentle slopes, higher and higher, merging at last with the mighty central pinnacle of beauty. The city was designed as a whole, not in a multitude of individually beautiful, but inharmonious units, like some wild mixture of melodies, each in itself beautiful, but mutually discordant. End of Chapter 4. Recording by Kirk Ziegler, Ogden, Utah, voiceover-solutions.com.